welcome to my channel. I am Karaleise and I'm talking to you today about the product backlog and how to manage offshore teams when you have lots of items in your product backlog. So that's the topic we're talking to you about today. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back. So I had a little time off and they asked, what do you want to do, Karaleise? And my answer is always, let's go to the woods. So I'm coming to you from a cabin in the woods. We're surrounded by nothing but bushes, literally in the middle of the forest. And there are some lovely, wonderful waterfalls up here in North Georgia. It's one of my favorite places to go when I need a break. So that's where we're coming from today. And we have a number of waterfalls that we're going to go see. Yesterday we went to a place that had goats on the roof. It was so quaint, so amazing. Was able to run through the vineyards and look at how they actually grow the wine that we were drinking. It was really wonderful. So I'm really having a good time, but I thought I'd take some time to still give you a video on agile and on managing offshore teams, either as a business analyst or as a scrum master or just product owner. This is something that any one of us working in this field is going to have to deal with, because there's so many projects that have offshore teams. And how do you manage that? How do you keep up with both sprints, or even if it's one sprint, and how do you keep both teams aligned? That is what we're going to be talking about. So don't go anywhere. Stay to the end. It's going to be good. So one of the things I liked about this cabin was it was so quaint. Look at this. Look at this thing. They have this really nice rustic feel with these old phones everywhere. There's, you know, images of bears and elks and horns, and it's just, I'll show you around in a minute so you can get a tour of my cabin. Alright, so that was the cabin. Now let's move on to what you really came here for, which was the product backlog. So let's talk about managing your product backlog. Now, I don't like to use a lot of acronyms in my videos because I want it to be easy for you to understand. A lot of times you watch videos on these things and they talk a lot about the PBI and the sprint items, and they get into all the jargons, which is great to know the jargons, but I want to make sure you walk away from this video understanding what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to give it to you layman style, right? In real world terms, from experience that I have on actual projects that I've experienced these things when you're trying to work on a software product with offshore teams who are obviously in different locations, but sometimes different time zones, different languages. How do you deal with that? How do you manage that? That's the point of this video. So stay to the end. So the first thing I want to say is, I think working with offshore teams is great because you get the benefit of having an extended team working on something while you can focus on something else. So it's really a good advantage, and many people have partnered with offshore teams, offshore companies, you know, consultants, contractors, to help them in their software development processes. The challenge, though, that comes with it are a few, right? The ones that I've experienced is probably primarily the time zone challenge. So you're in the US, your team is in India, your team is in Europe, your team is in, you know, just anywhere really, and you're trying to make sure you prepare for what they need to work on for the next day, but their next day is your night, and your night is their day. So when they have a question, there tends to be a little bit of a delay, and if there's something urgent, then they can't really get your answer, so they have to make a guess, or you have to wake up at 4 in the morning or 2 in the morning and try to solve for that. And that's the case with not just software development, but anybody who's working across time zones, global companies. So when you're working on software projects and they're like something is down, right? You got to make sure the team in India, you know, is making the right decisions to fix that, because you're, you know, in the morning when your US people wake up, you don't want them to have this downtime. So there's that kind of challenge. What I've found is just being very prepared and having stricter rules around how we make decisions, having SLAs and different things that determine what is the next step that you should take, and having people have the right access so that they can make, you know, decisions is usually very helpful. The problem is sometimes the person who can make the call is in the US, and the offshore team has to really wait for them to wake up to be able to give them the direction, or they ping them late in the night and they got to wake up and grab their computer wherever they are and solve the problem, right? So that's a challenge, and it's something we can work around for sure, but it's one of the things that come when you work with offshore teams, that you have to figure out a way to do that. Either you're going to give them the access and you're going to give them strict processes around when to do what, or you're going to have somebody who's just going to be on call almost 24 hours, right? If something goes down, which typically shouldn't be going down that often, so it's doable. But that's just one of the things that you wouldn't have necessarily. Well, you probably could have it still, even if it's in the same country, because things can go down in the middle of the night anyway. So it's not really a completely solvable problem. It just feels more accentuated when you talk about offshore teams. The main thing that affects us, or I would like to talk about when it comes to managing offshore teams on software projects, is the fact that you need to be very clear as to what the requirements are. And this gets into the realm of the business analyst or the product owner, where you may have these two teams who are working on the software, but maybe you want the one team to work on this piece of it and the other team to work on that piece of it, and the two have to come together at some point. So you need to be very specific and very clear in your requirements. Your user stories need to be very clear. Your acceptance criteria needs to be very clear. You need to be a part of all of the conversations to make sure you express what needs to happen, that there's clear understanding between the teams, and that nobody's doing something that's going to, you know, outdo the other person's work, or conflict with the work, or overwrite the work, right? So you're not creating activities over here that cause problems for the other team to do their job. So there's much more coordination that you need to have. There's much more communication that you need to have. And what I've seen, depending on the teams, that management of that is probably one of the most strenuous things. To make sure both teams are in sync at all times, it requires a lot of communication back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and you have to do it within the time zone when you both are up. So you may have to wake up earlier, they have to stay later. Something has to happen for you to have that conversation together, because if you leave it to just emails and Slack messages or Teams, it's not enough. I feel like when you send text messages, somehow something gets lost in translation. You need to get them on a call. You need to be talking to them. There needs to be conversation back and forth real time for them to really get the gist of everything that you need to get built. Even if you have documents that you send back and forth, the meeting is still going to be the one thing that I've found helps to pull the team together, helps to, you know, clarify all the doubts. And at the end of that meeting, everybody seems to walk away with better understanding than if they had read that either through an email, a message, or even a document. Hey guys, are you enjoying this video so far? I hope you are. But if you are, click the like button. Pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it, pump it. Pump the like button, y'all, and show me that you like this video so I can keep making more content just for you. Let's get back to it. The other thing I found in managing offshore teams is that if you're doing your scrum processes, right? So you're in an agile environment and you have a team in India, let's say, and a team in the US, and they need to work on this one software feature or tool, right? How do you organize the work? How does that happen? What's the best practice for that? Now you can have where each team does their own sprint and their own sprint planning and their own sprint grooming, and then they communicate back to each other what they have agreed to do. Or you could have one sprint where everybody's talking about the same things and they're all in the sprint. Again, because of time zone, that's kind of hard to schedule. But also the fact that you don't want them to be working on something that the other team is not ready to take up on. So you don't want to be too far ahead than the other team, because you could end up with this big gap that just doesn't work. So there's a lot of management if you're going to have two different sprints. And I would say that if you have a situation where you have a front end team and you have a back end team, and then you have two separate sprints, to me that's a recipe for disaster. Just don't do it. I've not seen it work properly. I've seen it create so much issues where there's a team, let's say this team is in Europe, let's say they're in Romania, for example, and then you have a team in the US working on the same product, the same software product, and they're doing two different sprints, and they're in two different time zones, and they're working on the same tool. And if you have a back-end team over here that's doing the work required for the front-end team on the other side of the world to use, then I just found that it just creates so much complication, because the front end team can go much faster sometimes than the back end team. Sometimes the back end team can go much faster than the front end team, and then you end up having one team waiting on the next team, and then sometimes what they output from the back end doesn't interface properly with what the front end is doing, and it's just a mess. It's just a mess. It can really get messy very quickly unless you have a whole lot of management to make sure that everybody knows exactly which thing goes in first. And there has to be like meticulous management and processes in place to make sure that works. If there is any flaw in your process, this situation with a front end team and a back end team in two different time zones, two different places, working on the same tool, is going to blow up. It's going to cause a lot of problems. I mean, if you've had it work in your organization, that's great. But I just found that everywhere I've worked where they've done that, the management of it, the processes behind it is just so immense that I don't know if it's worth the effort of having these two teams. I really don't know. I've not seen it work flawlessly anywhere. If you have, let me know. If you have where there's a front end team working on only front end and a back end team working on only back end, and they're doing two different sprints, they have two different grooming, and they're working on the same tool or the same feature and it works, you need to let me know, because I want to put that in my best practices, because I've never seen this work well. What I would say, or what I would suggest, where you have front end and back end specific coders or developers and the same tool and in two different time zones or two different regions, I would suggest that there is a little bit of end-to-end on each side of the team. So it means that you could do your two different sprints, but in one sprint you're taking a full flow, which at the end of that sprint, or that the goal of that sprint is to complete something specific, and that includes front end and back end. So the entire feature is completed from this one team, and the other one has the entire feature completed from that one team. So it feels like you have front end and back end in both teams. That way you can do a sprint and they can completely flow through the whole thing. So the front end person on this offshore team has a back-end person they're working with on the same offshore team in the same time zone, so they can communicate and get that feature done end to end. And then on the other side, in the other time zone, there's a front-end person. Maybe you have more front-end and only one back-end. Maybe you do it that way. But not having any back-end alone or any front-end alone in either teams doesn't work. Because the communication is going to go way off. You're going to end up with one team waiting on the next team for a long time. It just doesn't work. So I would suggest that there's two different sprints, but they include front end and back end tickets, so you can have a complete end-to-end deliverable at the end of each sprint. The other thing I found is that the communication needs to be very clear, even when you do have this kind of setup with front end and back end in both teams, where you make sure the goal of the sprint is very well articulated. You also need to make sure you have a lot of discussion in your sprint grooming, so you can tease out all the problems early, so that when you actually get into development, you've already had the discussions to make sure that the development of the sprint will be successful. And at the end of the sprint, when they have their demo, you can see what it is that you talked about for the goal of the sprint, and it would likely match what you anticipated. So the other thing I found when you have offshore teams is that you can have a backlog that's very, very long. You can have a lot of items in your backlog. And also when you do a sprint, you could have a lot of bugs coming in if you're using the same project, right, in Jira. So you could have the front end team creating bugs from the QA and the back end team also having bugs from the QA, and it could just end up being a very long bug list. And it might get hard to manage when you have a very, very long set of items in your sprint. So the thing I would suggest when you have really lots of items, bugs and enhancements and tasks, everything all together in the one sprint, I would suggest that you start prioritizing based on critical and based on high and based on medium and low, right? So yeah, this is typically for bugs. Now, if you have a scrum master, that's their job. You don't have to worry about that. But sometimes the product owner, sometimes the business analyst has to jump in there and do things. You may have a very formal environment where there is a big organization. You have specific roles that people are assigned to do. That is their job. Then if that's the case, you don't have to worry about it as a business analyst. But you may be in a small organization where you kind of have to do a lot of things that's really a little bit outside of the scope of your job. And that could be prioritizing the backlog, which is really a product owner job, right? And a scrum master job. But you may have to say, okay, there's so many items in this backlog. It's not going to work. You got to figure out how to help them prioritize. And it could just be in the sprint as well. You could be, the backlog is prioritized, but when they did the sprint, there were so many bugs that came out of what they developed that they created tickets and put it in the sprint. And now you have this immense long list of bugs and you're like, okay, which one do we work on first? You don't want somebody to be working on, let's say, a text change when there's a bigger problem that they should be focusing on. So you don't want them to do too many low-level bugs when the bigger bugs are not being looked at. And because you're all over the place in the sprint, the same sprint, but it's just so much of it, people might just not know where to go. So what I would suggest between the scrum master or the product owner or even you, the business analyst, is that you prioritize the bugs. You have to prioritize the bugs with the help of the product manager or the product owner. You got to say, hey, we have this many bugs in the sprint. We can't take on all of them before the sprint closes. What's the most important thing that we have to get fixed before the demo or before the release or whatever? And they'll help you prioritize the bugs so that your team can know what needs to be worked on. Because when you have offshore teams, they may be picking up whatever is there, but that might not be the priority, and they could be working on the wrong thing. So having offshore teams, it makes it more important for you to get the priority right and make sure it's clear and visible, meaning that your Jira is organized by priority, the most critical first, then the high, then the mediums, and the lows, right? So you got to make sure that happens. Now, you don't have to do it. It could be somebody else's job, so you let them do their job, but it has to be done. You have to make sure it is done. When you look at your Jira project, it needs to look that way. So in terms of being able to have a good process, having the right definition of ready and definition of done is very important when you're dealing with offshore teams, which means that they need to know what's available, what's ready for them to pick up to put in the sprint if they're doing separate sprint planning. So you have to make sure maybe your Jira statuses are well clear for them to know, okay, all the tickets, all the stories that are in this status is ready for you to pick up for going the next sprint. I have a video we talk about how to get Jira statuses. You can watch that. I also have another video about, writing user stories in Jira, how to prepare for the release with the sprints. So all of that is available in these videos. I'm going to put the link for you to go check it out. Yeah, so you need to make sure you have a good definition of ready, because that's going to say, okay, these tickets have been vetted. I've reviewed all the acceptance criteria. It has all the mock-ups, all the designs. It's very clearly written. It's ready for you to pick it up and make it a part of the next sprint. And then definition of done, which means that we have completed everything that needs to happen and this ticket can now be marked as done. Development is done. The product owner signs off on it. It's all ready to go. We're ready to put this in the demo. It's done, right? So that is making sure you have those two definitions properly defined when you're working with offshore teams, because it's very difficult to manage a product backlog with offshore team if you don't have good processes. So that was my little chat on managing offshore teams and how to make sure you organize your product backlog when you're dealing with offshore teams. I hope this was helpful as usual. Subscribe, like the video, check out my website, karaleise.com. You can find some free courses on there, some other paid courses on there. You can also book a consultation with me, where if you want personalized help, I help people who are about to go up for an interview for a business analyst job, or persons who have started a job and not sure how to start their first project. I give you lots of information one-on-one about how to grow in your career as a business analyst. And also check out my podcast. Right? It's available wherever you get your podcast, Applecast, Google, all of the places where you get Spotify, all of those places you can find it. It's called Real World Business Analysis with Karaleise. So if you're on the go, you can listen to my podcast and get some knowledge in you as you're doing whatever you're doing. All right, so I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching. Take care. Bye-bye. Now we're off to the waterfall. It's going to be so awesome. Bye.